Hey everyone, Barryz here. So, in case you missed the community post or the announcement in the Discord, I am no longer going to be able to continue making videos, due to personal reasons. I won't get into those personal reasons in this video, but as a thank you to all of you who have enjoyed watching me rant about the lore of these old Cybertron games, I've decided to make these two last videos covering the complete history of Cybertron. Some of this information you will have already watched from my other Lore For Cybertron videos, but some of it is new. In this first installation here, we will be going over everything that occurred on Cybertron before the Autobot-Decepticon Civil War. Now, before the video starts, I would just like to say that if you do want a complete both parts of these videos in one, just a super long video, let me know in the comments down below, and I will edit together a supercut of part 1 and part 2 into a massive video. However, enough malingering, let's get on with it. At the beginning of time, long before life on Earth ever evolved, an unknown, incomprehensible individual held ultimate and unlimited power within the universe. But this being had a battle within, between the love of the universe around him and the loneliness of the barren cosmos. Eventually, this unknown being's two personalities would clash so much that they would split into two entirely new entities, called Primus and Unicron. Unicron sought to create purpose within the universe by destruction, while Primus saw the beauty of the universe and wanted to see it grow and flourish. Primus and Unicron's opposing ideologies would often lead them to conflict. However, due to their equally matched power levels, the two would be locked in a constant stalemate for an impossible amount of time. Eventually, Primus sought to end the stalemate and tip the balance of power in his favor, but to do so, it would cost him a great deal. Primus would transform himself into a beautiful planet within the galaxy, a planet called Cybertron. But this sacrifice alone would not be enough to beat Unicron. So, like the original incomprehensible being before him, he would split his personality into 13 new beings. Deep within Cybertron, the 13 original primes would appear in several blinding flashes of light and deafening thunderous booms. Immediately after their creation, they would each feel Primus's light fade away into stasis. Primus's plan was to change the eternal stalemate by removing himself from the equation, and using the variety of life to defeat the solidarity of death. The goal of these 13 was to be so completely unique and full of potential that they would each offer a unique plan to deal with Unicron. Prima, the first of the 13, made in Primus's own image. Prima was self-assured, valuing the right thing above all else. His selfless conviction made him object to change in any way. Vector Prime was a no-nonsense, stoic leader who believed in order and rule over the universe to ensure peace. Alpha Trion was a wise poet who believed in the documentation of the history of the universe and his creator, Primus. Solus Prime was a great builder and inventor whose personality never failed to lighten the others. Micronus Prime was the smallest of the 13. His imagination and moral compass was a valued addition. Alchemist Prime was fascinated by the very elements that made up the universe, and was well versed in the reactions of molecules and the science behind the galaxy. Nexus Prime was fascinated with change and combination. He was able to merge technology seamlessly into new and superior forms. Onyx Prime was a far more spiritual member of the 13. He had a fascination and a connection with the life of the universe. Amalgamus Prime was a trickster who was able to morph his appearance at will, never taking a situation too seriously, and never holding a true solid form. Quintus Prime was a figure immortalized by his quest for universal perfectionism and order. His ideals often clashed with the more free-spirited of the 13. Liege Maximo was a brilliant tactician and master manipulator who harbored a darkness deep within. Megatronus Prime was a fiercely loyal and noble figure whose dark tendencies conflicted with his desire to honor Primus. And finally, 13, an unnamed Prime whose true identity remains a mystery. However, what information we do know about him is the knowledge that he was Primus's spark reincarnated. Despite the silence of their creator, Primus, the 13 Primes knew what their purpose and creation served. They knew that Unicron would be approaching. The 13 Primes split up into three main groups: The first group would be formed of warriors. Prima, Vector Prime, Onyx Prime, and Amalgamous Prime were assembled to be the main fighters who would take the brunt of Unicron's assault. Then there were the strategists. Alpha Trion, Quintus Prime, Liege Maximo, and Micronus Prime would create the battle plan which the warriors would follow. Finally, there was the free agents. Alchemist Prime, Solus Prime, Nexus Prime, and 13, who would be in charge of relaying the plans from the strategists to the warriors, along with attacking strategically fluid objectives that may reveal themselves on the battlefield. The warriors would train in improving their brute strength, while the strategists discussed and abandoned many battle plans, while the free agents relayed the progress of the two groups to each other. During this time, the personalities of the 13 subtly started to come into conflict with each other, specifically between the very Primus-aligned Prima and Megatronus, whose personality reflected much of Unicron's. Despite the rising tensions, their aligned goal unified the 13 against the looming presence of the Great Destroyer. It was during this time of training that Megatronus Prime would approach Solus Prime and ask her to invent a blaster for him to use in the coming conflict. While Solus Prime was at first hesitant to create such a devastating weapon, the trust she put in her friend allowed her to cautiously present him with the completed weapon, the Requiem Blaster. Megatronus was so honored by not only the quality of the weapon, but by her faith in him, that it seemed like the darkness that Primus imbued within him with a shard of Unicron had finally been balanced out by the love of Solus Prime. As their training continued, the friendship between the 13 grew, and eventually their battle plan was finalized. The warriors would take the brunt of Unicron's assault, while the strategists would cause precise damage to him to distract Unicron long enough for 13 to be inserted close to Unicron's core. Once close enough, 13 would use his own spark, the reincarnation of Primus himself, to deactivate both himself and Unicron. After the battle, the 12 other Primes would recover 13 and hopefully reactivate him. Eventually, the time finally came, and a dark shadow loomed over Cybertron. Unicron had arrived. Quickly, their battle plans were thrown into chaos. The Great Destroyer bore down on them with the might of an angry god. The Primes were completely underprepared for the onslaught. Unicron's very presence filled the 13 with utter despair and corruption. Despite the continued sorrow exposed by Unicron, the 13 managed to continue onwards with the reassurance from 13 that all would be won. Eventually, their plan succeeded. 13 managed to climb to Unicron's core and deactivate them both, sending Unicron hurtling out into space, seemingly defeated for good. However, their victory was not without cost. An entire portion of Cybertron remained ravaged, never to heal, and many grave wounds were suffered by the 13 Primes, greatest of which was the exposure to the darkness Unicron pulsed with, the corruption slowly eating away at their sparks. But with the Great Destroyer now defeated, they could only hope their tainted sparks would heal in time and be returned to the light which Primus imbued within them. However, the corruption Unicron exposed them to would not dissipate over time. Instead, it would fester and divide the 13 in the wake of Unicron's expulsion. Ironically, it is the splendor the 13 sought to create on Cybertron, which is what would be corrupted the most by Unicron's darkness. After Unicron's defeat, the 13 Primes would return their attention to their own personal goals and aspirations. This era would see the creation of Vector Sigma, what would become the Matrix of Leadership, the Enigma of Combination, the Covenant of Primus, and other unique artifacts. Prima, Vector Prime, and Alpha Trion would find a new interest in creating a form of government for their society. Liege Maximo, Megatronus Prime, and Amalgamous Prime concerned themselves mostly with the resources of the planet, like mining, purifying, and storing energon. The 3 Primes that concerned themselves with working and securing the resources needed for their continued survival would begin to view the 3 politicians as overbearing with all of their rules and regulations imposed upon them, with new rules being enforced seemingly every time they went to supply the 13 with resources. Micronus Prime, Nexus Prime, Solus Prime, and Onyx Prime all had little care for the politicians, or the resource scavengers, and just kept to themselves, and focused on their own creativity and arts. Alchemist Prime, Quintus Prime, and 13 worked for each of these groups, supplying the politicians and creative groups with the resources that the laborers provided, and informing the laborers of the new rules and regulations that they would be forced to abide by. Liege Maximo, however, was the true emissary of the 13, traveling freely between all groups and relaying information between them all. During this time period of post-Unicron defeat, the love between Solus Prime and Megatronus truly solidified, and the two of them made their relationship more well known to their friends. To which Prima, Vector Prime, and Alphatron were both confused and surprised by the thoughts of having feelings independent of their loyalty to their creator, Primus. Others, such as 13, Onyx Prime, and Micronus Prime, were not all that surprised by Megatronus and Solus's relationship. Solus was the true beam of light which illuminated the 13, and really brought them all together. She was usually the one who arranged meetings between them all when Liege Maximo and the free agents weren't relaying communications over long distances. The conversations between the 13 boomed once Liege Maximo discovered and relayed that Prima had made a chart detailing which of the 13 most resembled Unicron. He called the ones who were closer to Unicron Agents of Chaos. This information enraged Megatronus, who had been ashamed of the darkness within him. The familiar relationship between the 13 finally began truly crumbling when it was revealed that Liege Maximo, with the assistance of Quintus Prime and Megatronus Prime, had been creating robotic beasts. To protect himself from these beasts, he had commissioned an armor be made for him by Solus Prime, to which she built but did not deliver. These robotic beasts were not alive yet. He was building what were effectively models of these creatures, but Solus Prime and some of the others still felt like there was something off about the animals. They were specifically worried by the fact that Liege Maximo needed such a strong suit of armor to deal with these creatures, which they felt uncomfortable around the possibility of these animals being given life and the freedom to harm them. Liege Maximo, however, in his seemingly infinite charisma, managed to calm everyone's worries by telling them that he would reveal everything in due time. Liege Maximo even managed to sway Solus Prime to his side by gifting her a small beast, to which she grew to love and care for. Prima, however, was not so easily persuaded, and knew that there was something off about these animals. Prima ordered that Liege Maximo's farm be shut down. The farm, as it was called, was the laboratory which Liege Maximo used to create these beasts. Prima added that if Liege Maximo wouldn't shut them down, then Prima himself would be forced to. Seeing how Liege Maximo clearly wouldn't abandon the farm, Alpha Trion decided he would follow Liege Maximo to his lab. Once there, Alpha Trion would learn that Liege Maximo had actually given life to some of the larger beasts and forced them to fight each other. And perhaps even worse, experiments were being conducted in the caves below. Liege Maximo began pressuring Solus Prime to deliver him the armor which he so badly needed, saying that he would need it if he could hope to shut down the farm safely. However, perhaps she was able to see past his charm, as Solus Prime did not provide the armor to Liege Maximo. Eventually, the conflict between Liege Maximo and Prima became too much to bear, and 13 decided to put Liege Maximo's right to experiment up to a vote. The vote would go forward and result in a near tie, with Solus Prime having the deciding vote between 13. Despite her disapproval of Prima's way of shutting down Liege Maximo, she did side with him, causing Liege Maximo to be forced to eventually shut down the farm. Right after the vote ended, Liege Maximo went to convince Megatronus Prime to try to leverage his relationship with Solus Prime and collect the armor for him. Megatronus agreed, and left for Solus Prime's forge. Suddenly, the Primes heard a tremendous blast come from the forge. Once they arrived, they found Solus Prime dead, killed by the very Requiem blaster she had forged for Megatronus. The Primes were devastated by their first loss. Not even Unicron had managed to kill any of them, which is what made Solus Prime's sudden murder that much more surprising and sad. Some of the Primes, such as Onyx, were inconsolable with grief. Others, like Prima, were furious, and wanted vengeance on Megatronus for killing one of their own. 13 tried to calm everyone and prevent such a hostile view of things, seeking to find a solution with the least violent outcome. However, many refused his arguments. As the Primes were gathered around her body, Solus Prime began to glow a bright blue color, and then atomized in front of them. Her body melted down into the planet itself, going deeper and deeper until eventually resting at what would be known as the Well of Allsparks. The now 11 Primes hunted Megatronus down with ease, and upon finding him, he willingly explained what had happened. Once Megatronus had entered Solus Prime's forge, he found a device that he swears was left for him by Liege Maximo. Through this device, Liege Maximo monitored Solus Prime. This device was that pet mentioned earlier. Solus Prime caught him in her forge and said that Liege Maximo was only using Megatronus and playing him for a fool. Megatronus was enraged by her perceived weakness of him, and he tried to steal the armor from her. She again caught him and repossessed the armor from Megatronus, after which she also ordered him to surrender the Requiem blaster she had made for him. What happened next was a reaction of her supposed betrayal and his own resentment for being imbued with Unicron's darkness. The two began to fight, and her pet, unknown to her as being one of Liege Maximo's spies, attacked Megatronus, who then shot it with the Requiem blaster. Upon seeing the death of her supposed pet, Solus Prime swung her hammer at Megatronus, who reacted quickly by shooting her with his Requiem blaster. Strangely enough, the Requiem blaster didn't kill her instantly. Megatronus didn't mean to shoot her. It was a reaction to the imminent danger he faced. He tried to apologize to her in her last dying moments, but her final words to him were brief, professing her love to Megatronus. Once the Primes learned of Maximo's manipulation, they traveled to the farm, arriving to see Maximo still hadn't shut it down. Maximo tried to blame everything on Megatronus as the big evil mastermind behind it all, saying that Megatronus's dark nature meant he used the beasts as gladiator enemies, which he would use to test his strength against. Megatronus was enraged by these accusations and now knew that Solus Prime was right, that Maximo had engineered everything for Megatronus to take the fall. A massive battle breaks out between the Primes, which leads to the ground beneath them giving way, and all 12 of them fall into the caves below. Down there, the 12 are set upon by massive beasts, which had been created in the farm. Once Alpha Trion and the 13 awoke sometime after the battle, the beasts had been killed. Maximo was torn to pieces, his head blasted off by the recognizable shot from the Requiem blaster. Onyx Prime was fatally wounded and would die shortly after. After the war, a tomb was built to honor Solus Prime, and strangely enough, another built for Liege Maximo. Megatronus, stricken with the grief of what he had done to not only Solus Prime, but to the rest of the 13, renamed himself the Fallen, and decided he would banish himself from Cybertron, and to honor Solus Prime, he would take a ship into space and set out to help any life he could, swearing to be a pacifist from then on. The surviving Primes began a new plan for their world. They would retire themselves from the equation, taking inspiration from their creator. Onyx Prime would delve into the depths of the Well of Allsparks, where its continued rejuvenation would keep him alive for an eternity, yet would never heal his wounds fully. Once Onyx was in place, he would use the power of the Well of Allsparks to split up the power of the Primes and create a whole new race to inhabit the planet. A race of autonomous, transforming robots, which would bring light to the future of Cybertron. 13 decided to enter the Well of Allsparks to be remade into one of these Cybertronians. Quintus Prime left to seed life in space around Cybertron, presumably being the creator of the Quintessons. Prima and Alpha Trion would stay and mentor the Cybertronians in the early ages of their evolution. And lastly, Micronus Prime chose to delve into the depths of the Well of Allsparks to be with Onyx Prime, his best friend, who would not have to suffer an eternity alone. And with that final note of friendship, the Age of Primes comes to an end. Once the great Primes had all found their resting places, a great upheaval rumbled across Cybertron. From the Well of Allsparks, a great beam shone across the cosmos, glimmering down on Cybertron and distant planets beyond. Alchemist Prime recognized this beam as the gaze of the Triptych Mask, a legendary Cybertronian artifact forged by Solus Prime. The Triptych Mask scanned the universe for its many varied life forms, using the data it gathered to inform the designs of a new race of inhabitants upon Cybertron. From the Well of Allsparks, a great number of new life emerged, be it small, simple spiders or titanic robots the size of cities. From the well emerged a truly massive creature to rival them all, Trypticon, a Cybertronian so large he could effectively be considered Cybertron's third moon. Along with Trypticon emerged a massive Cybertronian, not as large as Trypticon, but still equally impressive. This Cybertronian would declare himself Omega Supreme, and announced his dedication to protecting the Omega Key, which unlocked the core of Cybertron itself. This great surge of life on Cybertron lasted for 3 days, after which the number of new life generated by the well slowed but did not stop. The remaining original Primes watched over a race of bipedal intelligent life forms that looked to be a far more primitive and smaller version of themselves. Eventually, the surviving Primes established contact with the race of Cybertronians, taking their primitive group mentality and guiding it with their own aid and intelligence. Despite Prima arguing otherwise, Alpha Trion decided it would be best for this new race of Cybertronians to live without knowledge of their T-Cogs and ability to transform. He most likely hid this information with the intention of it being a temporary solution, allowing the Cybertronians to better familiarize themselves with their bodies in Cybertronians' geography, before gaining the powers of extreme locomotion. The original Primes banded the Cybertronians together in an early version of what would eventually become the Cybertron world government, with themselves at the top of the hierarchy. On the third day of life, however, a new race of beings emerged from the Well of Allsparks. This new race would be known as Predacons, massive dragon-like beasts which would feed off of unlucky Cybertronians, the first of which taking its place as their leader named Predaking. The Predacons would typically eat members on the outskirts of the still-growing civilizations around the planet. These Predacons would be known as an incredible threat to the blossoming Cybertronian civilization, and the original Primes would soon realize that the threat of the beasts needed to be resolved. And so, Prima, the Great Warrior Prime, embarked on a quest to fell the mighty Predaking, in order to protect their growing yet weak population. Prima would find Predaking in one of the wild regions on Cybertron, and challenged the mighty beast to a duel. Predaking accepted, and the two would fight for days on end, each dealing devastating blows to each other. Eventually, Prima would stand victorious over Predaking. However, instead of killing the dragon outright, Prima offered Predaking a deal. Provided Predaking and his kind cease all predation on sentient Cybertronians, Prima would ensure no Cybertronians ventured into and disturbed the Predacons' wild regions of Cybertron. Predaking reluctantly accepted the terms, and Prima returned to civilization. Upon his return, Prima was delighted to see that Alpha Trion and the other Primes had nurtured the Cybertronian world government into becoming a beautiful yet simple civilization, which provided equal protection and wealth for all Cybertronians. However, despite the remarkable progress, Cybertronian civilization was still primitive, as none had yet learned their powers of transformation. While building upon the Cybertron world government, the temporary pass of a swollen red star tugged free an armada of asteroids from the debris belt beyond the fifth planet of Cybertron's system, and sent them hurling towards the unprotected world. Though the Primes deflected many of them, they could not stop them all. Meteors smashed into Cybertron and plunged it into the equivalent of a nuclear winter. Though this was not as fatal of a blow as it would be to organic life, there was a second threat that was far more deadly. The pull of the second star caused vast solar flares to burst forth from their planet's star and scourge Cybertron in an apocalyptic fire and radiation that no life form could survive. The Primes did the only thing they could, and gathered as many Cybertronians as possible into the deep underground caves. There they might be shielded. Many life forms would be extinguished forever during the Cataclysm. On the surface, most of the life forms on Cybertron that weren't the Transformers themselves went extinct, such as the Predacons, and supposedly the Titans. Due to the apocalyptic event, the Cybertronian world government is left shattered and disconnected, leaving power vacuums for warlords, tyrants, and slavers who seize control of small pockets of Cybertronians within the planet, all completely unaware of the new threat above the surface. After the breakdown of the Cybertron world government, Prima was left so distraught that he abandoned Alpha Trion and their civilization, ranted to the Cybertronians about Unicron's return, and left the Cybertronians, never to be seen again. Some Cybertronians considered Unicron to just be a ghost story, or an old legend which held no real threat, while others convened in secret and formed a cult around the ancient destroyer. This cult would name themselves the Heralds of Unicron. The Cybertronians would slowly arise from the caves, wandering back into the civilizations they were forced to abandon. They'd begun to rebuild their cities, however, still lacked any form of government. High above the surface, however, Quintessons spied down on the Cybertronians with great interest. At first, they maintained their lack of contact. Then, they began abducting lone surface dwellers, including one named Coldwelder, a miner in the Sea of Ages who was abducted and probed by the Quintessons. But the Quintessons who abducted him messed up the procedure, resulting in the poor bot losing one of his eyes. After Coldwelder awoke on the side of the road, he calmly made his way into a new city named Iacon, to be seen by Junior Medical Officer Ratchet and Senior Medical Officer Cogwheel. Shortly after the Coldwelder incident, the Quintessons would reveal themselves to the Cybertronians, offering them technological advancements in the form of mastery over their T-Cogs and spaceflight. The Cybertronians, now with ambassadors by the names of Zeta Prime and Sentinel Prime, rejoiced their new visitors, and with their help, the Cybertronian world government reformed, with their new visitors holding an immense amount of power within it. It's at this time that we see things like the Council of Primes assemble, along with the Elite Guard, which at this time was actually meant to protect the Quintessons and not the Primes. During this time, Sentinel Prime would recuse Alpha Trion of all power he held within the old Cybertron world government, effectively banishing him to work in the data archives. While in the data archives, Alpha Trion would mentor a young Cybertronian by the name of Orion Pax, taking the young bot under his wing, so to speak. The Quintessons begun to artificially restructure the Cybertronians' social hierarchy, with a utilitarian approach to society, forcing worker classes. This oppression got so extreme to the point that some Transformers, born of the Well of Allsparks, were coming out with no names or personalities. Around this time, it is also noteworthy that a certain D16 was born into becoming a minor within the bowels of Kaon. The Quintessons also began forming the Cybertronians into what they desired, such as forcing Seekers to have cockpits to transport them. Finally, the Quintessons created the Supreme Court, a system which would demand execution for any Cybertronian which would dare rise against the Quintessons' growing corrupt power. The Quintessons began building massive structures, to which Elite Guard members Prowl and Bluestreak investigated. They took what information they could before returning to their scientist partner named Shockwave, who then translated the ancient text revealing the Quintessons' plan to build space bridges to sell off the Cybertronians as slaves. The three of them took their findings to Senator Soundwave, who then reviewed what the three of them had collected and advised Zeta Prime of their findings. They created a plan that would begin the war for their freedom, Plan TCOG, which consisted of traveling to the Well of Allsparks and showing the Cybertronian people that they could transform without the assistance of the Quintessons. Upon the completion of Plan TCOG, the entirety of the Cybertronian population rose up against the Quintessons, and the Wrath War promptly began. What followed was one of the greatest conflicts the planet had ever seen. Zeta Prime took the Elite Guard and all those who would follow him into battle, including D16. While D16 was busy helping Zeta Prime kill the Quintessons, an archivist named Orion Pax renamed himself to Optimus and was sent on secret missions to advise other Resistance leaders on Quintesson weaknesses and tactical strategies. The Quintessons were eventually defeated at the hands of Zeta Prime, D16, and countless others, bringing in the golden age of Cybertron. However, some Quintessons were able to flee Cybertron and take up refuge on a neighboring colony planet named Aquatron, vowing to one day return to Cybertron and make the Transformers pay for what they did. After the Cybertronians had defeated the Quintessons, they were left with a wealth of technology that was abandoned by their previous oppressors. While most had a rough understanding of what the technology was, the Heralds of Unicron seemed to have an above-average knowledge on their technology, some of which even seemed too advanced for the Quintessons. However, the majority of Cybertronians knew of the space portals between points of time. The Quintessons called them space bridges. While originally constructed to transport large quantities of Transformers off-world for slave labor, the Cybertronians managed to reverse engineer the space bridges, among other Quintesson technologies. They used the space bridges to begin the expansionism of the Cybertronian Empire, colonizing and terraforming different planets. Zeta Prime and his scientists were worried about the populations of these colony planets, however, and begun experiments to ensure that Cybertronian life could be born on these colony planets, if they were ever cut off from Cybertron itself. Once the scientists had developed a theoretical solution to the colony's survival, they ordered each colony planet to build a mimic of the Well of Allsparks. Once completed, a ceremony was held in which Zeta Prime transported a newly created spark from the well to Iacon, to which he sent it through a space bridge to the first colony world of Archon. The colony's leader, Metalhawk, took the spark to the artificial copy of the Well of Allsparks. The copy of the well hummed to life, and with it came the assurance that the Cybertronian people could survive on their colony worlds. New Transformers would emerge from this copy of the well, namely of which being System Swipe, who would later go on to becoming a Decepticon archivist. The age of expansionism was joyful for the Cybertronians, who saw new life emerge on colony planets from similar copies of the Well of Allsparks. However, over time, the Keepers of the Wells reported the slowing generation of new life from the copies of the well, and seeing as how they had been cannibalizing the original well on Cybertron, Zeta Prime decided to become more conservative with powering the colony's wells, instead focusing solely on the well on Cybertron. The colonies effectively became cut off from Cybertron, and Zeta Prime's image became tarnished for his seeming lack of care when it came to the outer colonies. Before any kind of civil war could come about, however, something rapturous began to slowly make itself known. Rumors around Cybertron grew of a transport ship that had been infected with a horrible disease that corroded any metal which came in contact with it, with the terrifying detail that the disease even infects Transformers. It is likely that this rust disease originated from an unknown planet that the Cybertronian pioneers wished to colonize. However, upon their arrival, they noticed the quick buildup of rust and left the planet. However, their quick exit would not stop the disease from corroding them all, leaving them to deactivate and turn to dust. The rust was highly contagious, as any metal that corroded only added to the moisture in the air, therefore creating more rust. This rumor turned out to be true when news quickly spread of the plague ravaging colony worlds, and spreading between them through the space bridges. The Cybertronians quickly attempted to find a cure for the cosmic rust. However, any hope of a plague was quickly eroded, as any researchers or medical personnel were quickly consumed by the rust. Whole research outposts and hospitals were completely turned to dust overnight. The horrors of the plague spread so fast that it was quite often for Transformers to arrive on a planet just in time to see any civilization crumble to dust. Zeta Prime and his council would view a priority transmission, in which a researcher would record how the plague had quickly worked itself through the ship and its crew. The researcher finished the transmission by revealing that he himself had become infected by the plague, and that his dying wish is that all ships, even suspected of containing the plague, be completely obliterated in orbit before they can further spread the plague. Zeta Prime came to the spark-breaking decision to deactivate all the space bridges that connected to Cybertron itself, completely cutting off all the colonies in the hopes that the plague would never spread to Cybertron itself. Knowing that some desperate Cybertronians would attempt to reactivate the space bridges to save themselves, he also ordered all the space bridges to be completely destroyed. As time grew on, the Cybertronians concluded that the Rust Plague had been halted from reaching Cybertron. However, the colony planets were unfortunately not doing so well. Now that they were completely cut off from Cybertron, those that weren't corrupted by the plague would eventually wither and die as their wells dried up and Cybertronian life would come to a slow and quiet end on those colony planets. Zeta Prime's image would now be completely eroded by the stain of his decisions. While he did potentially save all of Cybertronian life from the plague, many would see his abandonment of the colony worlds as cruel and controversial. So that has been all from me for this video. In the next and final installation of the Lore for Cybertron series, I will be going over everything to do with the Autobot and Decepticon Civil War. How it started, the many battles, and what happened in between levels, between the games, and of course, what happened in the High Moon games. Thank you all for watching this video. All hail Megatron.